Can an EMP push us back to the 1800s? And if so, what can we do about it? An electromagnetic pulse is a burst of electromagnetic energy whose origins can be natural or man-made. The electromagnetic interference caused by an EMP can disrupt communications and electrical components. And in warfare, EMP weapons can be designed to disrupt computers, targeting acquisition networks, and even disrupt the electrical network of an entire country. Or so we're told. In this video, we're going to break down the threat caused by EMPs by looking at historical and scientific evidence, so we can properly assess the risk and consider mitigation efforts. This is the first in a series breaking down many of the commonly understood larger threats to our society by approaching them in the same way that the military does, with a master scenario event list, or MESL. You see, too often we begin with an end state without backwards planning and considering the second and third order of effects of the decisions that we make prior to getting to a specific point. Now, there are two primary EMPs that we must consider, the natural and the man-made. The first recorded EMP was a geomagnetic storm called the Carrington event, which peaked in September of 1859. But the Carrington event isn't the only one. In 2003, for example, coronal mass ejection events caused 3 geomagnetic storms, known as the Halloween solar storm, and it resulted in the Wide Area Augmentation System, think GPS, that is used by the FAA to be offline for 30 hours in addition to the interruption of other satellites. There have been several other EMPs caused by geomagnetic storms in the past 100 years, but none have resulted in anything other than minor damage to infrastructure that could not be repaired quickly. The most famous, well-known, and most studied nuclear explosion that generated an EMP large enough to cause disruption was called the Starfish Prime. It exploded a 1.44 megaton bomb 250 miles above the Earth in the Pacific, approximately 900 miles away from Hawaii. You probably heard about the devastating impact of the EMP that it had on Hawaii in your history books in school, because it kept the island chain from entering the 21st century. Oh wait, it didn't. It did knock out some streetlights and triggered some burglar alarms, though. Does that mean that an EMP poses no significant threats? Not quite. Consider the complex magnetic field and its role in the calculation of an EMP's destruction. Or that the Starfish Prime was only a 1.44 megaton bomb, and that the largest nuclear blast yield in history came courtesy of the SAR bomb that yielded a 57 megaton explosion. The problem with EMPs is that in order to generate any disruption, it requires a large nuclear detonation at high altitude. Nuclear blasts at or near ground level produce almost no noticeable electromagnetic damage. Now, of course, this quickly narrows down the field of those capable of deploying such weapons. Now, this is probably the one event that we'll discuss that is a singular event, right? EMP, then what? There's not a requirement of events that lead up to and trigger the EMP. A threat could deploy a high-altitude, large-yielding nuclear bomb. The probability of that happening, we'll discuss in a little bit as far as, again, who can actually do this. By the United States, and it most certainly would have an impact. So don't misunderstand me by saying that EMPs pose absolutely no threat. Consider the Starfish Prime. There was actually, during that time, there were many high-altitude explosions. This is the only one during that time that had any EMP results or effects. And as we saw, only a few streetlights went out. And don't forget that there were planes flying around the sky, and there were naval ships floating around the sea. And not a single one, not a single plane fell from the sky, not a single naval ship sank to the bottom of the sea, right? But should a large nuclear detonation happen at high altitude above the United States, there would, again, certainly be some impact. Consider what we've seen before, right? Earlier in 2003, we had the GPS system that had a malfunction. Now, those satellites, of course, are much higher. Consider Starlink, for example, that uses low orbiting satellites. They would almost certainly have some kind of an impact from an EMP. Consider our dated electrical grid, right? How our grid is set up in the United States is dated, but much of the technology that's used in that grid has been upgraded. IBM, for example, also it was in the late 90s or early 2000s after an EMP, had some damage to some of their infrastructure, and they specifically, as a result of the EMP, shielded a lot of their equipment. Now, maybe you're concerned about EMPs, and you want to know what you can do to protect yourself and your equipment. The hard truth is, you need some sort of metal shielding between the EMP and your electric device or component. It could be a very thin metal shielding. It just needs to surround at 360 degrees to ensure that it's going to be safe. The problem is, of course, if it's not in this cage, then it's not protected. And you're not going to have an early warning of an EMP. This is not something that you're going to hear and have time to respond to. It will literally be EMP, then what? So a lot of folks will sell you on how to prepare yourself and how to protect yourself and your home and your loved ones, and tell you all the things to do. All the while, we live a daily life that requires us to use, or that necessitates us to use our electrical devices on the daily. But consider that all you need, again, is some sort of metal shielding between that electrical component and the EMP. Does it need to be 360 degrees? I would argue probably not. As we saw in Hawaii, all you had were some street lamps and some burglar alarms that went off, and I think they had some other small electrical devices that went out. But what we also saw is that EMPs do not cause an utter destruction. It's not just simply going to fry your computers or your computer chips. Your fuses may blow, and that's probably, odds are, step number one that may happen. And all you have to do is replace a fuse. Now, I'm sure that there's a lot of folks out there who are like, Stoker, man, you are full of shit. EMP is the number one threat that our nation is posed against, right? This is the number one thing that is literally going to take us back and hold us down, hostage, setting the stage for some ground invasion or other air attack or whatever. And if that's your thoughts, I would challenge you to leave some comments down below and cite and source some data. Let's have a conversation about this. Again, an EMP is a threat. Is it the most probable threat? Who can deploy an EMP large enough to have any kind of disruption on the United States? As we know, it cannot be a ground burst. This is scientifically proven. A ground burst will have no interference or no effect from an EMP. It has to be at high altitude, 250 miles. Who can do that? China, Russia, the United States. Some would argue North Korea, but as we've seen their targeting systems being deployed, it's not so bueno, right? Launching one up to 250 miles with specific targeting and acquisition is something that most people out there can't do. So would Russia pose a threat to us with an EMP? They certainly have nuclear warheads that are large enough to do that, as does China, and I think that they both have the technology to be able to do so. But again, so does the United States. So, is it probable? Probably not. Probably not. On the scale of 0 to 10, it's close to 0. At the end of the day, like, there are a lot more things that are more probable to happen than an EMP. I can't live my life on the daily worrying about an EMP, then what? It's a fun process to go through and to consider and to think about. How am I going to get home? How am I going to communicate? What's going to happen then? How am I going to get some backup power going? How can I make some minor repairs to my own equipment? How can I deploy a PACE plan for all of my systems? Do I make a Faraday cage and have some spares stored in there? Do I rely on other means of producing electrical current to keep the daily life running? Do I even care about electricity? What would it have? What would the impact be on logistics and sustainment for a community? Certainly a lot of things to consider, so don't get me wrong. But again, I'm looking to hear your thoughts and your comments down below as we continue to master our craft and develop our tactical virtue. Team, I appreciate you guys, and until then, you stay out there, you keep grinding, and you stay stoked.
We know you're out there! Come to my voice!
Team, if you want to master your craft and develop your tactical virtue, make sure you subscribe to the channel and click that notification bell so that you can stay up to date on future content. Consider becoming a channel member. It's going to give you exclusive access to content not available to anybody else. I appreciate you guys. Until then, you stay out there, you keep grinding, and you stay stoked.